Many believe Prime Minister Justin Trudeau dropped the ball when asked if Canada would increase oil and gas production in light of many countries banning Russian oil due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To discuss this in more detail is political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley. Brian, so what you're saying is that our Prime Minister was not necessarily promoting Alberta's ethical oil?
He's not promoting Alberta's ethical oil or the oil from Saskatchewan or Manitoba or even to a smaller degree British Columbia or a larger degree Newfoundland and Labrador. No, he's not promoting it at all. And at the same time, we've got leaders in places like Latvia saying, send us what you can. We need off of Russian, for Latvia, it's primarily natural gas. But, Trudeau was asked directly about this during a news conference in London on Monday. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that the UK would step up production, that they would work with leaseholders to do what they can to increase production. Justin Trudeau said, we will be there for Russia, but then turned to talking about helping decarbonize economies and talking about making sure that there's more renewables in the mix. That's not a bad thing in the long term, Hal, but in the immediate term, what could Canada be doing? We could be removing barriers. Look, the price of oil is through the roof. It is in the best economic interest of the companies who hold these, lease agreements for resource extraction to ramp up production if they can. But there are also things that the federal government could do to get out of the way, to make it easier and make it easier for them to ship, to export, to remove barriers, to drop the carbon tax, things like that, that would make it more lucrative, which also makes it better for us in our efforts to help Ukraine, because this is a war that is, if it's not centered around oil, it is funded by oil and gas. It is funded by Vladimir Putin filling his coffers with European money to wage war on Ukraine. We could be doing something to help reduce that. The Europeans say they want an alternative, or as Boris Johnson called it, a substitute supply, and we're not offering that.
So our Prime Minister was in London, England, now he's in Latvia. Brian, what's the true purpose of this trip?
There is value in world leaders getting together face to face, just like you and I getting together face to face as opposed to virtually. Politics in this sort of environment, when you're trying to get people to act maybe in ways they don't want to go harder against Putin, having a face to face meeting, as any salesperson will tell you, is far better. And at this point, we're in the sales process still of convincing world leaders what they need to do. As much as I am a harsh critic of Justin Trudeau, I will say that on this front, when it comes to sanctions against Russia and calling for more aid for Russia, he has been doing very well the past several weeks. He was, along with the United Kingdom, even before the US, one of the first at saying, we've got to isolate Russian banks through the SWIFT international transfer system. That is crippling to Russia's economy. That hurts them. It hurts their ability to transfer their funds into something that makes it viable for them to buy what they need. It makes life more difficult for the oligarchs, for the Putin regime. Canada was front and center on that. So, some people are just dismissing this as a photo op. I would say that getting together with leaders that you agree with, but also those who aren't quite there yet, can help move things forward. In Latvia, part of the reason for going there was to visit the brigade that Canada has. We are in command of the forces, the NATO forces in Latvia, and we have committed to extending that mission now. That's something that he announced on Tuesday morning while he was there with the head of NATO, the president of Latvia, the prime minister of Spain, all of these world leaders gathering. So, yeah, is there a photo op element to it? Absolutely, but there is real value in people meeting face to face.
So Defense Minister Anita Nunn said Canada's seriously thinking of sending drones to help Ukraine. Now, Brian, a plane load of military aid, some of it lethal, took off from CFB Trenton bound for Poland. Now, do you think that Canada's really doing enough to help Ukraine in its war against Russia?
Given how long we've let our military go by the wayside, I think we're doing what we can. Are we punching above our weight the way that we did in the First World War, the Second World War, Korea? No, because we simply don't have that capability anymore. We have sent thousands of rocket launchers. We have sent hundreds, about 100 actually, anti-tank systems, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition that go with it. We have sent rifles. We've sent hospital gear. All of that's good. Sending drones would be a nice addition to that. We are doing what we can, but this is what you end up with when you've let your military just be an afterthought for so long. The last time that we had a really significant increase in Canada's defense spending that impacted it in a way of capabilities was early in the Harper governments, in the 2006 through 2008 or 9 era. And even after that, the Harper government realized there was no benefit for them in increasing military spending, because even conservative voters weren't voting for them based on that. Liberal voters aren't interested in the military. So there's no real benefit for a politician to invest in the military until something like this comes along and reminds us the world can be a dangerous place.
Freedom Convoy organizer TAMARA LICH has been freed on bail, but she's also been told to get out of Ottawa. Brian, tell us more about this bail ruling.
So yeah, the bail ruling came down on Monday, and this was an appeal of an earlier bail ruling that said she had to stay. So a couple of things on that. One, her lawyer had argued that the initial denial of bail was brought about by the fact that the judge in that case was a former Liberal candidate. Well, the judge in this case, Justice John Johnson, he took issue with that and said that is a dangerous argument for you to be making. You shouldn't be making that. He himself is a former candidate for the Progressive Conservative Party, the federal one, that doesn't exist anymore, back in 2000. Judges are often involved in politics, but it doesn't mean that they make the decisions based on that. What's the difference between the first bail hearing and the second one? In the first bail hearing, TAMARA LICH wanted her surety, the person who would guarantee she wouldn't escape and go away somewhere. She wanted that to be her husband. Well, her husband wouldn't exactly tell the court how he got to Ottawa. Well, I was on a private plane. Well, whose private plane? Well, I don't really remember his name. Actually, I don't want to say. Oh, his name was Joseph. Well, can you tell us more? No. So are you going to release her to someone who's got access to a private plane and won't tell the court what it's about? Probably not. She's got a new surety. The order was be out of Ottawa within 24 hours, be out of Ontario within, I think, 72 hours, and then you've got to go home to Medicine Hat and stay home. So the judge did say that the charges she's facing do not require bail. Honestly, I think if she had a different surety in the first bail hearing, she would have been released. But I know people want to rail against various issues, but when you're saying, yeah, my husband will make sure I don't skip out, and he's not answering questions, judges are going to look twice at that sort of thing. Big difference. They got a better argument, they got a better surety, and they agreed to conditions that they weren't comfortable with in the past.
Brian, a NANOS poll taken about 2 weeks ago, just released, shows that whether people supported the trucker convoy or not depended hugely on where they lived, their employment situation, and whether they could work remotely. Tell me more about that.
Obviously, no surprise that there was a bit more support for the convoy in Western Canada than Eastern Canada. And for the rest of the country, it depended on whether locally people voted for the Trudeau government or not. In areas where the Trudeau government's not popular, the Freedom Convoy was more popular. That's not a big surprise. But what is interesting, especially when you consider the way it was sometimes portrayed by my colleagues in the media, is that younger people were more likely to say they supported the aims and missions of the Freedom Convoy. The reason for that, their employment situation. Younger people are in much more precarious employment positions than you and I, Hal, later in our career, established. The other factor was, were you able to work remotely or not? People who weren't able to work remotely and were likely to end up laid off or have hours cut or face economic repercussions due to COVID mandates and COVID restrictions, they were more likely to support it. It's why you saw a lot of small business owners, restaurant owners, and in various people from those sorts of industries coming out, regardless of their politics, and saying, yeah, I'm on board with this. Why? Because it affected them on a personal and very deep financial level. So those were the main things. The Zoom class weren't interested in the trucker convoy. Why? COVID hadn't really affected them, other than they couldn't go out to restaurants at various times. But, someone would deliver their Uber Eats order and they'd be fine with that. So very much a class, an age, and a workplace situation were the determining factors in this NANOS poll.
Now, the same polling firm NANOS found that while a number of Canadians in central Canada didn't really appreciate the Freedom Convoy, they also did not like the way Justin Trudeau handled the situation.
It kind of a pox on all your houses. So it was about 22% across the country said in the NANOS poll said they supported the Freedom Convoy, and just shy of 72% said they didn't, and then the rest, unsure, didn't know. But then when it came to, do you support the way Justin Trudeau handled it, he is taking a knock on this, and we've seen this in several polls, be it from Angus Reid Institute, from NANOS, from Maru Public Opinion to Ipsos. They've all seen that the prime minister, people didn't like that he was so angry, that he was so divisive, that he played wedge politics. And of course, that's something that you and I called him out for early on, Hal, but that other people said, oh no, that's not true. Maybe things changed when people like Joel Lightbound, his own Liberal MP from Quebec City area, came out and said, I'm uncomfortable with the wedge politics being played. Maybe that had a number of other Canadians sit up, take notice, and say, you know what? Whether I agree with these people or not, they're fellow Canadians. We shouldn't be treating each other like this. I think there was some of that going on. Justin Trudeau does not escape from this unscathed. I'm sure his supporters would tell you otherwise, but every single major polling firm that's looked into this has found otherwise.
Brian, last week, MPs from across the country and party lines voted for a Bloc Québécois motion, meaning that Quebec would receive special status in the Commons, while us here in Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario would be penalized. Explain what happened there.
So it's a non-binding motion, but it is a voice vote of the will of Parliament on what they think should happen. And it was response to an Elections Canada redistribution of seats proposal. Under that redistribution, due to population changes, Quebec would lose one seat. They would go from 78 seats to 77 seats. Ontario would go from 121 to 122. BC would go from, I'm on the spot here, I think from 42 to 43. Alberta would get, I believe, 3 extra seats. But the numbers, if you look at it, are still disproportionate. The House of Commons voted and said, you know what? We don't like this. Not because the numbers were still unfair to Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia, but because Quebec would lose a seat. And so they voted for a motion that said not only should Quebec not lose a seat, but Quebec's political weight in the House of Commons should never change. So even if Quebec's population either shrinks or remains stagnant, and Ontario, Alberta, and BC, which for the last 20 years have been the growing major growth population-wise, even if we grow and grow, Quebec has to keep its current 23 or so percent of the seats in the House of Commons. Is that really fair? I would argue that it's not. To put this into perspective, if Ontario, Alberta, and BC all got the same seating situation as Quebec with their current 78, Ontario would go from 134 to, 121 to 134. That would be 13 more seats. Alberta would go from, I think you're at 34 right now, to 40. And BC would go from 42 to 47. That shows you how underrepresented we are compared to Quebec. But these MPs from every party and across the country voted in favor. There were even conservative MPs in Alberta. Earl Dreeshen, for example, voted in favor of this. 103 MPs in Ontario voted for this. And the majority of MPs in British Columbia voted for it. It was mind-boggling to me how there were about 65 conservatives, or actually exactly 65 conservatives voted against this, along with one Liberal, longtime Toronto Liberal MP, John Mackay. Other than that, everybody said, yeah, let's make sure Quebec is always overrepresented in the House of Commons. Completely unfair.
Now, speaking of Quebec, former Quebec Premier Jean Charest has not officially announced that he's seeking the CPC leadership, but it appears as though the frontrunner so far, Pierre Poilievre, has been taking a few shots at Charest.
Yeah, so, it's funny. I keep talking to conservatives who are definitely in the Pierre Poilievre camp, and they say, well, Charest's not a serious contender. And I said, really? Have you looked at how the Pierre Poilievre camp is targeting him? They see him as a serious contender. And whether it's my own phone call with Pierre Poilievre last week or people on his team What do they talk to me about other than their own policies and how their campaign's going? Charade, charade, charade. They're not worried about Peter MacKay. I don't think Peter MacKay's getting into the race this time. They're not worried about Brampton Mayor and former Ontario PC leader Patrick Brown. They don't mention him at all, but they do bring up charade, and they've got graphics ready to go, and they have, their surrogates taking shots at him. Charest is a serious contender for the Conservative leadership. He is likely going to announce on Thursday. I was told last week, expect something on Monday night. Well, on Monday night, they announced he's going to formally announce on Thursday. So he's going to step forward. He's going to put his name into the race. And then you're going to have two serious contenders with still a bunch of other people underneath, including Leslyn Lewis, Joel Etienne. There's a mid-Ontario guy named Scott Aitchison looking at it. So there will be other candidates in the race. But at this point, unless somebody else jumps in, these are the two front runners. And then if Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown jumps in, he's right behind them in the hunt for the big prize.
It'll be interesting to see the way this plays out between now and September when the Conservatives choose their new leader. Political reporter and Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Hal.